My name is Lucas. I'm 29. And this is exactly the kind of story I never expected to tell. Because honestly, I never expected it to happen. Let me paint you a scene. It's early morning. That Minas Gerais light that creeps through the shutters slowly before you're even ready for it. I'm standing in the bedroom doorway, barefoot, with bedhead, still in that grogginess that sticks to you during the first few minutes of the day. And there in the kitchen, my kitchen, in the house I rent, there's a man making coffee. 45 years old, broad shoulders, hair graying at the temples. He handles the coffee maker as if he knows exactly where everything is, because at this point, he does. His back is to me, but I can hear the familiar sound of his steps on the wooden floor, the smell of coffee taking over the small space of that kitchen. The sun hasn't even fully come through the backyard window yet, and he's here. So quiet, so present, as if it had always been this way. This man is Renato. He's my landlord. Or he was. That line became so blurred that I don't even know how to draw it anymore. And I stand there looking at him, and I think, how do we get to this place? How do you leave São Paulo wanting nothing but silence, wanting nothing but a wall between you and everything that hurts, and end up here, in a small house in the countryside of Minas, watching the man who rented you the place make coffee in your kitchen as if it were the most natural thing in the world? Have you ever had the feeling that life handed you exactly what you said you didn't want? Not in a cruel way. In a way that, when you look back, makes perfect sense, as if you were following a map you didn't know you were carrying. So, yeah, I'll tell you how I got here. But first, you need to understand who I was before Renato. Because the story doesn't start with him. It starts with me. With the Lucas who walked into this small house with white walls carrying a suitcase and a firm resolution not to get involved with anyone. I need you to understand this, Lucas. To understand what it means for me to be here, now, watching this man make coffee with the intimacy of someone who has always belonged here. São Paulo and I had a tacit agreement. She provided enough noise so I wouldn't have to hear my own thoughts, and I'd pretend that was living. For 6 years, I dated a man named Rodrigo. 6 years is enough time to learn someone's habits, someone's silences, the specific way someone has of disappointing you repeatedly while still convincing you that things will change. Rodrigo wasn't bad. He was a man who was discovering who he was, slowly, stumbling in my presence. And I stayed by his side for too long, hoping that this discovery would end in some way that included me. It didn't end that way. In the end, he told me he needed space to think. I asked about what. He said he didn't know exactly. And I realized, in that moment, that 6 years had passed, and he still didn't know. And that I had spent those 6 years waiting for someone who never fully arrived, who was always about to arrive, always, almost there, always on the threshold of some clarity that never became real. It wasn't the pain of abandonment that destroyed me. It was the exhaustion. That specific exhaustion of someone who has been holding an open space for a long time. A place you prepared for someone who never quite stepped in. Have you ever felt that? Not the loss itself, but the exhaustion of having waited? I sat in the living room of the apartment that was suddenly mine alone and realized I wasn't devastated. I was exhausted. And with a quiet resolution that grew in the following days, never again. Never again be at the disposal of someone who is still finding themselves. I already know who I am. I already know what I want. Next time, the other person needs to know too. That resolution seemed mature to me at the time. Today, I understand it was also an elegant way of closing myself off. The small town was my idea. I needed a fresh start that didn't look like São Paulo in any way. Without the apartment that was ours, and suddenly, was just mine, without the coffee shops where Rodrigo and I had gone, without the mutual friends who kept asking me how I was with an expression of someone who already knows the answer. Working remotely as a graphic designer gave me that freedom. As long as I had decent internet and a laptop that worked, I could be anywhere. So I opened the map and looked for a place that wasn't on any best cities to live list. I wanted anonymity, not curation. The city I found is in the interior of Minas Gerais, about 15,000 inhabitants. That kind of town where everyone knows each other by name and nickname and their grandparents' history. Red earth, the smell of coffee and old wood, humid heat by day, nights that cooled down in a way São Paulo never did. The ad appeared almost at the end of the list. Simple, poorly framed photos, the kind of photo a man takes with his phone without thinking much about angle or lighting. A wooden porch, a kitchen with old blue floral tiles, a bedroom with a window facing a backyard with a large tree in the center. Price more reasonable than I expected, and a single contact line. Talk to Renato. I sent a message on a Thursday night without much expectation. He replied the next morning. Few words, direct. He set a time for me to see the property the following week, if I wanted to. I did. Driving to a town of 15,000 people after years of living in the country's largest metropolis has a dreamlike quality. The landscape changes slowly. The overpasses vanish, the buildings disappear, the soil turns redder, and the sky becomes larger and bluer than you remember blue could be. I arrived in the early afternoon, in that small town heat that hits differently. The address led me to a street of low houses with front gardens, the kind of street where everyone knows everyone else's name. The door was ajar when I arrived. I knocked, and Renato appeared. I don't know exactly what I expected. Some kind of white-collar figure maybe. A man of paperwork, contract clauses, and business talk. What appeared at the door was a man with a firm posture, thick hands that looked like they had been fixing things his whole life, and eyes that assessed me briefly, without being rude. He was wearing a collarless button-down shirt, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He smelled like freshly sanded wood. He said, "Lucas?" I said yes. He opened the door and showed me the house in almost complete silence. Each room came with 1 or 2 functional sentences. The sink was replaced 2 years ago. The window locks from the inside, right here. The shower has good pressure. It wasn't coldness, it was just his way. A way of not wasting words on what doesn't need to be said. I noticed things while he showed me around. The absence of personal photos on the walls. Everything had been recently painted white. That kind of white used by someone starting something over. A tool forgotten on the porch, a yellow pocket level, leaning in the corner as if he had just used it. The smell of new wood coming from one of the rooms, as if a renovation had finished weeks before. When we went out to the veranda to finalize the contract details, he said without looking at me, the house was empty for about 10 months. I took the chance to renovate it. I said I could tell that it looked beautiful. He made a gesture with his head that wasn't exactly an agreement, but wasn't a disagreement either. He handed over the keys with a mute objectivity. In 10 minutes, he was gone. I stayed in the house alone, looking at the white walls, listening to the silence of a small town, which is completely different from the silence of an empty apartment in São Paulo. Small town silence has texture. There's the song of a distant bird, the sound of a door closing 2 backyards away, the muffled sound of a television through a neighbor's open window. It's an inhabited silence. And I thought, with a conviction that seemed solid at the time, at least I won't have any trouble with the landlord. 3 weeks. That's how long it took for my conviction to start cracking. The bed in the bedroom had a problem. I had to sleep in it 3 nights in a row before I understood what it was. A loose beam in the internal structure. The kind of thing that creaks in a specific way when you turn on your side during the night. It wasn't unbearable. It was just that constant sound of wood giving way a bit more than it should. That sound that, in the silence of the countryside, seems louder than it is, and ends up becoming the center of your attention when all you want to do is sleep. On the fourth night, I sent a message to Renato, short, descriptive. The bedroom bed is creaking a lot. I think something is loose in the frame. When you get a chance to take a look. He replied, tomorrow, in the late afternoon. He showed up at 5:30 with a toolbox in hand, the kind of orange metal box that looks like it has survived decades of use, dented at the edges, with a piece of masking tape on the lid where someone had written Renato in black marker. He came in, went straight to the bedroom, knelt beside the bed, and began examining the structure with the calm attention of someone who knows exactly what they are looking for. The bedroom was small. I already knew that, but it had never bothered me. When you live alone, small is cozy. With Renato inside it, the room felt different. It wasn't an invasion. It was just the presence of someone large in a space calibrated for one person. I leaned against the doorframe, a bit unsettled, not knowing where to rest my gaze. Have you ever been in a small space with someone and become much more conscious of your own body than you should be? Not for any explicit reason. Just because of the size of the space, the inevitable proximity, the way you suddenly become aware of where every part of you is, of how many centimeters exist between you and the other person. I felt that way. Renato didn't talk while he worked. He moved the bed frame with silent concentration, occasionally asking for better light. I tilted my phone, doing what I could. At one point, he needed to get apart from the box that was near my feet, and when he stood up and passed by me, I took a step back, by reflex, a step I didn't need to take, because there was enough room. He didn't notice, or pretended not to. The repair took 40 minutes. When he finished, he tested the bed. He stood up, pushed the frame, and listened to the silence that proved the problem was solved. Then he looked at me for the first time in 40 minutes. Done. I said thank you, and, out of politeness, offered him a glass of water. He accepted. I didn't expect him to accept. We went out to the porch. He leaned against the railing, glass in hand, looking out at the street. The sun was setting behind the houses across the way, and the light turned that specific shade of orange from a Minas afternoon that you never forget. That light that makes everything seem even quieter than it already is. The city was making its usual noises. A motorcycle passing by, a dog barking 2 streets over, the distant sound of a television through a neighbor's open window. Renato asked short questions. Where I was from, what I did, why I had ended up here. I answered. Not much, just the basics. Remote work, tired of the big city, wanted to try a different pace. He listened without rushing, without that urgency of someone who is being polite, but actually wants to end the conversation quickly. He really listened. I noticed that. At some point, we fell silent. Not the uncomfortable silence of 2 strangers who have run out of things to talk about. It was a quieter kind of silence. The kind that happens between people who don't feel the need to fill every second of shared presence with sound, as if silence were also a form of conversation. I realized I was comfortable. That made me uncomfortable. When he left, I went back inside. And there, leaning against the kitchen doorframe, was his toolbox. Orange, heavy, with that masking tape label. He had forgotten it. I looked at the box for a second. Then I went to sleep. 3 days passed. I didn't message him about the box. I can't explain exactly why. I knew I should have. He was going to need it. But every time I picked up my phone to send the message, I stopped. I'd leave it for later. I told myself I'd send it another time, that he probably had another one, that it wasn't urgent. Deep down, what I knew was that as long as that box was in my kitchen, there was a concrete reason for him to come back, and I wasn't ready to examine what that meant yet. The downtown bakery was the kind of place that only exists in towns like this. Formica tables, that bread display at the entrance, a radio playing sertanejo at a low volume, and a constant flow of people who know each other by name and have time to talk. I started going every morning because the coffee was good and because there was something curiously comforting about being in a place where everyone is at ease, even if you aren't. It was the third day the toolbox had been there when I heard his name for the first time out of context. 2 older men, a table by the window. I had my laptop open, pretending to work, but the town was still new enough that every conversation became interesting background noise. Poor Renato. 18 years with Eliane. They drifted apart, from what I gather. They did. But you know Renato. He's not one for talking. Never was. He kept the house. She moved to Belo Horizonte to be with her parents. I think it was for the best. They broke up about 12 months ago, and he already seems more at peace. And then the conversation turned to something else, the way bakery conversations do. I went back to my coffee. I looked at the laptop without seeing anything written on it. 18 years. Eliane. The town thought they had drifted apart. I remembered the white walls of the renovated house, the smell of fresh paint, the tool forgotten on the porch, as if someone had stopped a project in the middle. The way Renato had said, without looking at me, almost expressionless, "The house has been empty for about 10 months. I took the opportunity to renovate." As if renovating was the only response available to him when he was left alone with his own time. I knew nothing about Renato. It wasn't my business to know. But I started putting together a puzzle he hadn't asked me to solve, right there at the Formica table, with my coffee getting cold in the mug. That afternoon, I sent the message. "You forgot your toolbox here. Whenever you want to come pick it up." The reply came faster than the other times. "Tomorrow morning, if that works for you." It did. He showed up at 8 in the morning, when the light was still low and the dew was still on the grass in the backyard. I had made coffee, not specifically for him, I told myself, just because I was going to have some anyway. I offered him some when he came in. He accepted again. This time, it wasn't just about grabbing the box and leaving. We stayed on the porch with our mugs and the quiet morning around us, and the conversation was different. I can't say exactly what changed. Maybe the time of day, maybe coffee instead of water, or maybe just the fact that it was the third time we'd been in the same space, and the initial awkwardness had dissolved somehow. He mentioned the renovation. Not me, him. He said he'd spent about 8 months fixing up and improving the house, that there were things that had been pending for years, details he had put off for no clear reason. "When you live with someone for a long time," he said, looking out at the yard, "you keep putting those things off. It feels like there's time. Then time runs out, and you realize you'd built up a huge list of things to do that you never did." I didn't ask about the marriage. It wasn't my business. But I listened to every word with an attention I hadn't planned on giving. "The house needed it," he continued, "and I needed it too, to have something to do with my hands." He went quiet after that. The kind of quiet of someone who said more than they intended and is weighing whether to continue. He didn't continue, but I realized that divorce wasn't just an administrative fact for him. It was a before and an after. One of those milestones that divide life into 2 eras, without you necessarily choosing where to place the marker. And there was something surrounding that milestone he wasn't saying, not out of dishonesty, but because the right words hadn't been found yet. What I didn't understand yet, what was starting to make me ask questions I hadn't asked to ask, was exactly what had ended in that 18-year marriage. What the men at the bakery called drifting apart had a texture more complicated than that explanation allowed for. I felt it in the way Renato referenced the past, always with that specific restraint of someone choosing their words carefully, as if certain words would open a door he hadn't yet decided to open. He left with the toolbox. I stayed on the porch with an empty mug and breakfast slowly getting cold. And I realized, with an uncomfortable clarity, that I was paying too much attention to a man who told me nothing beyond the strictly necessary. That realization should have slowed me down. It didn't. There was no conscious decision on his part to keep showing up. Or at least, that's what I kept telling myself for a while, as the visits became more frequent for increasingly thin reasons. The water valve dripped a week later, a constant drip, drip, drip that starts to get annoying after a few hours. Renato showed up the same day I let him know. He stayed for 40 minutes, fixed it, had coffee, and left. The front gate lock started jamming 3 days later. Renato came, looked at it, said the lock was worn out, and that he'd bring a new one. He came back 2 days later with the new lock, installed it in 20 minutes, and stayed longer than necessary. Then the reasons got even thinner. One afternoon he showed up, just to check if the electrical wiring in the back room was okay. I hadn't even asked. He'd mentioned checking it during the last visit. Then, once he passed by and came in, just to let me know that a neighbor's roof from the same era had some issues, and that he'd take a look at mine too when he could. He took a look. He stayed. Do you notice when someone is inventing reasons to be around? There's a different quality to it. The pretexts have a fragility that makes them, paradoxically, more revealing than any explicit declaration. Every flimsy excuse says, I want to be here, and I don't know how to say it without the excuse yet. I noticed, and I kept letting him in. We stopped pretending the porch was just for landlord-tenant talk. Sometimes he'd arrive and I'd be working on my laptop at the kitchen table, and he'd hang around while I finished something, and the conversation would happen naturally, about the city, about his work, about nothing in particular, about everything two people talk about when they're being honest about the fact that they want to be in the same room. There was a Thursday. I remember it was Thursday because I had an early video meeting with a client, and I spent the whole day trying to finish some visual identity pieces with that precarious concentration of someone with a deadline and a wandering mind. He showed up late in the afternoon without warning. My kitchen was a mess from prepping something quick between tasks, and when he walked in, I was haphazardly chopping vegetables with the focus of someone thinking about something else. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a second. I said, "There's coffee if you want," without looking up. He said, "Are you making dinner by yourself in this state?" I said it was all I had. He didn't answer, but he stayed. He grabbed a knife, started helping me chop without asking permission or making a fuss, as if it were natural, as if he had been in this kitchen dozens of times, as if he knew where everything was, as if sharing this space was the simplest thing in the world. I looked at him for a second, not knowing what to do with that ease. We had dinner together. The boundary had existed, and now it didn't anymore. It wasn't a dramatic collapse. It was a slow dissolution that happened somewhere around the third bite, when I realized I was completely at ease with that man at my table, that there was nothing strange or calculated about the scene, that it was simply two men sharing a meal in a small kitchen, and that it felt right in a way I couldn't articulate, but that was undeniable. And then, that moment. We stood up at the same time to take the plates. The kitchen was small. I've said that already. We reached for the same shelf at the same time, and our hands touched. For a second. Less than a second. He pulled his hand away first. I pulled mine, and neither of us said a word. The silence that followed lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it had the weight of an entire conversation. Afterward, we kept washing the dishes as if nothing had happened, but something had. I went to sleep that night, knowing I was in trouble in a way that wasn't new. It was exactly the kind of trouble I had promised myself I'd never get into again. The difference is that this time, unlike all the other times I'd built up arguments against getting involved, no argument showed up. There was silence where there should have been reasons. Before leaving that night, Renato stood at the door for a moment. He looked at me, not with the quick functional glance of previous times, but in a more lingering way, like someone allowing themselves to really see something. And then he said, almost as if it were an observation about the property, "I've renovated everything in the house, every room, except one." I asked which one. "The master bedroom," he said. "I still don't know what to do with it." He turned and left. I stared at the closed door for a long time. You know how sometimes people talk about one thing when they're actually talking about something else entirely? How sometimes a room isn't just a room, it's everything you've left to deal with later. Everything you don't know how to name yet. Everything you're not ready to touch. I knew. And I knew he wasn't talking about the room. Kawa arrived on a Friday. I saw him from the window, a young man in his early 20s getting out of a car on Renato Street, carrying a backpack like someone staying for a few days. Renato was waiting on the sidewalk. They hugged with that specific father-son embrace of a reunion real affection, but also that distance of people who have spent time living in separate places and need a moment to recalibrate their closeness. I formally met him on Saturday morning, when Renato stopped in front of me with him by his side. "This is Kawa, my son. He's here for a few days." Kawa shook my hand with a polite smile. He was 22, and had Renato's eyes that quality of attention that observes without apparent judgment, or almost without it, because there was something in that young gaze that was sharper than superficial politeness suggested. He looked at me for a second longer than necessary. Then he looked at his father. He didn't say a word, just that look. That weekend, Renato disappeared. No messages, no visits. Complete silence where there had previously been a constant flow of pretexts and presents. I understood why, and I told myself I understood. He had his son at home. It was natural to prioritize time with him. It was what he was supposed to do. But understanding the reason didn't stop the silence from having a specific taste. The exact taste of confirmation of something I had tried not to believe, but had always known, could be true. That I was a parenthesis. That when Renato's real life appeared, son, family, what the town knew and what the town expected of him, I was the thing that disappeared. That it would always be this way. Life would continue to organize itself around other priorities, and I would stay here renting the house, exchanging functional messages about water meters and stuck locks, and nothing that had happened in the previous weeks would have been what I felt it was. I had been in this place before, with Rodrigo. 6 years of being the thing that disappears when real life walks through the door. I wasn't going to do that again. On Monday, I made a decision. I could feel what I felt. There was no way to control that, but I wasn't going to act on it. I wasn't going to let those visits continue to be what they had started to become. I was going to put back the distance that had existed at the beginning. Landlord and tenant. Functional. Clean. Monday night, the rain started. In the countryside of Minas, when the rain truly comes, it comes all at once. I was sitting in the living room with my laptop when I heard it hitting the zinc tiles in the backyard, a steady growing percussion that increased until it became the kind of rain that seems to want to say something, that makes the world feel smaller and more closed off around your house. At 10 o'clock that night, there was a knock at the door. I opened it, and Renato was there, wet in a way that showed he had left home without thinking about an umbrella, like someone who leaves before even deciding to leave. With an expression I had never seen on him before. It wasn't desolation, it wasn't urgency. It was something quieter than that, and heavier, like someone who had spent the whole day trying not to arrive somewhere and gave up trying. I stepped back to let him in. He entered but stopped on the covered porch. He didn't want to go inside the house, just get out of the rain enough. I went out there with him. We sat on the porch steps, with the rain falling just a few feet from our toes. The town was completely silent. That specific quiet of small towns under heavy rain, when everyone is indoors and the streets are left only to the rain. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Renato said, "Kawan left earlier today." I said I understood. He was silent for a bit longer, and then he started to talk. Not in an organized way, not in a way I can reproduce for you as a structured speech. It was more like fragments that kept coming about the marriage, about the 18 years with Eliane, about the way he had of being present in everything, but never completely present in anything, about the constant feeling that there was something out of reach that he couldn't name or grasp. "It wasn't her fault," he said. "She never gave me a reason to leave. It was me who could never quite arrive completely." I listened without interrupting. I always had the feeling that something was missing, something I should feel but didn't. Not constantly, just this background noise, this thing that stays quiet inside, that you learn to ignore because you don't know what to do with it. The rain continued. "When we broke up, I expected to be devastated," he said. "And I wasn't. I was sad. I felt guilty, but not devastated. And that scared me more than the divorce itself, that I hadn't felt what I should have felt." He looked at the rain. A long silence. "And then you arrived." He went quiet after that, as if he had reached an edge and stopped right on the brink. He had reached an edge. I felt it. I felt how much it cost him to be there, to say that. I also felt how much I wanted to keep listening. And I felt, with painful precision, how careful I needed to be, not for myself, but for this fragile, real thing he was holding in his hand, without quite knowing how. After a while, he stood up, said it was late, said he was sorry for showing up like that. I didn't say he didn't need to apologize, because I didn't want to be the kind of person who says that as a reflex, without thinking about what they're saying. He walked to the edge of the porch. The rain was lighter now, and he stood there for about 3 seconds back to me, looking at the wet street without moving. 3 seconds that lasted longer than they should have. Then he left. I kept staring at the spot where he had been. The rain washed the cobblestones, and the city was quiet. And I knew, with all the uncomfortable clarity of someone who finally stops lying to themselves, that my Monday decision had already left, along with Renato, on that rainy night. I was completely involved, and the only question that remained was whether he would have the courage to come back and finish the sentence. 2 days passed. I worked, made coffee, walked to the bakery twice, answered emails. I did everything you do when you're waiting for something and trying not to look like you're waiting. I carried those 3 seconds of Renato standing at the edge of the porch as if they were an unanswered question, and those are the worst kind, aren't they? Unanswered questions from someone you can't ask. On Wednesday afternoon, he sent me a message. 3 words. "Can I stop by today?" I took a second before responding. Then I wrote, "You can." He knocked on the door at 9 in the evening. He was different. Not dramatically different, not shaken like on the rainy night. It was a quieter difference, like someone who had spent 2 days working through something internally, not without pain, but with determination, and had come out the other side in a way he didn't fully recognize yet, but from which he would no longer retreat. We went to the porch. It was our place, I had realized. Most of the real conversations had happened there, in that liminal space between inside and out, where it was possible to be at ease without being completely exposed. The night was cold. One of those meanest nights, with a clear sky after the rain from 2 days before, where you can see the stars with a clarity that the big city doesn't allow. The street was empty. The city was quiet with that stillness that comes when everyone has gone to sleep and the world belongs only to you. We sat side by side for a while without speaking. Then Renato said, "Kawa asked me what's going on with me." I waited. He said I've been different since the divorce, that I seemed more present somehow, and that he didn't understand what had changed. He paused. He's 22, and he already notices when his father is different. More than I noticed when I was 22. He looked at his hands. Those calloused hands I had learned to notice the way they held things, the way they worked, the way they had pulled away from mine that night in the kitchen. I didn't know how to answer him. Not completely. I said I was fine, that the divorce had been hard, but it was passing. He wasn't satisfied with that, but he left anyway. More silence. I didn't fill it. I can't stop thinking about what I was going to say to you that night, in the rain. I said carefully, "What were you going to say?" He took a deep breath. Not the nervous kind, the kind of breath taken by someone about to do something that can't be undone. That breath I recognize as the breath before courage. "That since you arrived here, I can't think straight," he said. His voice came out with a raw, stripped-down quality, no ornament, no beating around the bush. That I invent reason after reason to show up at this house. That when I'm here, everything feels more. He searched for the word, found none that fit on its own, so he used two. More real, quieter. He looked at me. Not a quick functional glance, a long direct look from someone who had finally decided to truly see. "I don't know what to do with this," he said. "I've never felt this for a man before. Or..." He stopped. He started again, slower, like someone finding the words as they speak. "I never allowed myself to feel it. I don't know which one. And I don't know if it makes a difference at this point. Do you know that moment when all the arguments you built, all the layers of protection, all the sensible reasons, all the painfully acquired wisdom about why you shouldn't get involved with someone who's still discovering themselves, simply cease to exist? Not as a decision, not as a conscious choice. They just stop. As if they had never really been there. It was like that. I thought of Rodrigo. I thought of the 6 years. I thought of the resolution I had made when I left São Paulo. Never again to be at the beck and call of someone who is still discovering who they are. And then I looked at Renato. Renato, who was 45, had a tired look, and had spent 18 years in an honest marriage that was never complete, because there was something he could never quite name. Renato, who had renovated the entire house, except for one room he didn't know what to do with. Renato, who made up reason after reason to show up, who forgot his toolbox, who would stand still in the doorway in the rain for 3 seconds before leaving. This wasn't a man discovering that he might be interested in men in some distant, abstract way, like an intellectual experiment. This was a man who already knew what he was feeling and was telling me, with every heavy word of someone speaking for the first time about something they've carried in silence for a very long time. There's a difference. It took me 2 days to understand what it was, but now I understood it clearly. Rodrigo never knew what he wanted. He was looking for something that didn't have a name yet, and I was part of the discovery process, not the destination. Renato knew. He was just learning how to say it. I said, "Renato." He looked at me. "I got involved," I said. "A long time ago. I kept trying not to get involved, and it didn't work." He stayed quiet for a second. Then, something in that reserved face I had learned to read. Something that was almost relief, but deeper than that. The kind of thing that appears on someone's face when a tension they've carried for a long time finally finds a place to land. "I'm afraid," he said, not as a confession of weakness, as a fact he was willing to name. "Me too," I said. "I always have been. I don't know how to do this right." "No one does," I said. "We learn as we go. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be real." We stayed in silence for a moment with that between us. Not an empty silence, but the kind of silence that happens when the right words have been spoken and need a moment to settle. And then he stepped closer. Not all at once. Slowly, with that innate serenity, and hugged me. A hug that had no urgency or performance, that had only the weight of everything that had led up to that point. I felt the smell of wood and coffee, and the cold Minas night around us, and the specific warmth of someone who has finally arrived after walking for a long time. We stayed like that for a while. Then he pulled back a little. He looked at me closely, and then, slowly, with the care of someone doing something for the first time and wanting to do it right, he kissed me. It wasn't a movie kiss. It was better than that. It was a kiss that had 18 years of silence on one side and a painful breakup on the other, that had months of visits with excuses and forgotten boxes and conversations on the porch, that had all the accumulated tension of two men who knew what they wanted and were waiting for the right moment to say it. It had the real weight of everything that had led up to that point. When we pulled apart, the city was still quiet around us. The stars were still there. The porch was still the same liminal space as always, between inside and out. Renato said, maintaining that same disarming frankness as always, "I'm not leaving today." And he didn't leave. In the morning, I woke up before him. I stood in the bedroom doorway for a moment, as I always do, before moving. And it was then that I saw the scene I described to you at the beginning of this story. Renato in the kitchen, fiddling with the coffee maker, with that low, early morning light coming through the shutters. He knew where the coffee was because he had been in this kitchen dozens of times. He knew where the mug I used was. He knew I took it without sugar. I watched him for a while. It wasn't an ending. I understood that, with a quiet clarity I didn't expect to have. It was a beginning, harder and more real and more uncertain than any ending could ever be. There was the city outside that knew everyone and had an opinion about everything. There was Kawa, 22 years old, who loved his father and didn't yet know what that love would need to accommodate. There was the weight of a man learning, at 45, how to be whole. There was my own story of someone who learned to keep their distance and was still learning how not to. A Lucas who came to this city looking for silence and found instead someone. None of those things had disappeared overnight. But when Renato turned and found me standing at the door, there was something in his face I hadn't seen before. A lightness that wasn't the opposite of seriousness. It was what seriousness becomes when it finally lands in the right place. Like wood that stops creaking when the beam finds the right fit. He raised the mug toward me. A silent question. I walked into the kitchen. We spent some time without speaking, both with our coffee, the morning slowly opening up through the backyard window. The sun was coming through the large tree in the yard and making those patches of light on the wooden floor that shift slowly while you're not paying attention. Then he said, "I'm going to have to talk to Kawa, for real this time." I said I knew. "It's going to be hard." "It is. You're telling me it's going to be hard, but that it's worth it." I said, "I'm saying I have no way of knowing exactly what it's going to be. I'm saying I think you already know the difference between hard and impossible, and that this right here isn't impossible." He was quiet with that for a moment. Then he made the nod I had learned to translate as agreement, not enthusiasm, not an easy promise, just the honest acknowledgement that there was something here worth whatever it was going to cost. "I'm not going to pretend that what I feel doesn't exist anymore," he said. "I spent too much time doing that." I said, "I'm not asking for speed, just honesty." Something in his expression settled at that. We had our coffee. He left before lunch. He had commitments. Life went on being life. But he left different. With that steadier step of someone who knows where they're standing. Someone who woke up knowing what's true and decided not to undo that knowledge. And I stayed in the kitchen with an empty mug and the quiet morning all around me, thinking. Thinking about what I learned in this story that's still just beginning. That the fear of being someone's experiment can make us push away people who aren't figuring out what they feel. They're just figuring out how to say it. That there's a massive difference between a man who uses you as a test to confirm or deny some abstract doubt, and a man who knows what he feels, but never had the words for it. The first one leaves once he finds the answer. The second was waiting for a place to finally arrive. I learned that sometimes love shows up in the form of a man with calloused hands who comes to fix a bed and forgets his toolbox. That sometimes the fresh start you came looking for in a small town isn't the quiet solitude you imagined. It's more complicated and more alive and more frightening and much more yours than that. I learned that the courage to risk it again after being hurt isn't weakness disguised as strength. It's just courage, plain and simple. Have you ever been in a place like that? Where love appeared in a way you didn't expect, from someone you had good reasons to turn away? Where you had to choose between the protection you built so carefully and the real possibility of something good? Tell me in the comments. Seriously, this story matters to me, and your stories matter to me just the same. Every single one of them. If you identified with anything here, with Lucas or Renato, or both at the same time, write to me. We need these conversations. If this video touched you in some way, give it a like. It helps so much to bring more stories like this to the channel, stories that are real and human, and aren't afraid of being complicated. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe. We have more stories coming every week, stories of courage and recognition and love that appears from where you least expect it. I'm Lucas, and this was the story of how my 45-year-old landlord came to fix a bed and never left. See you tomorrow.